Hello, my name is Miriam Razak, and I will be discussing one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. The Libby, Montana asbestos disaster was the result of corporate greed and would impact the people of Libby, Montana, and neighboring towns for decades. For some context, I will discuss the purpose of this presentation and provide a brief background into the elements that led to this disaster. Next, I will examine the health and environmental impacts resulting from asbestos exposure and finish up by discussing EPA Superfund sites in Libby, Montana. The purpose of this presentation is to provide background information regarding one of America's worst environmental disasters, illustrate its range of impact from environmental damage to human health risks, and discuss EPA interventions. Gold miners discovered the mineral vermiculite in Libby, Montana in the 1880s. In 1963, the Maryland-based W.R. Grayson Company bought the Zonolite Company. While in operation, the mine produced 80% of the world's supply of vermiculite. The material was used in building insulation and as a soil conditioner. Unfortunately, the vermiculite from the mine was contaminated with a toxic and highly crumbly form of amphibial asbestos. Despite several previous complaints of lung problems from miners, the company claimed it was unaware of hazardous conditions. Townspeople were also affected from the asbestos-tainted vermiculite because Grayson Co. had distributed its leftover vermiculite for use in locations such as playgrounds, gardens, and roads. In addition, asbestos from the mine circulated in the air and made its way to baseball fields and other areas residents frequented. Although the mine closed in the 1990s, the EPA did not step in until 1999. What followed was the largest asbestos removal project in U.S. history. In 2002, the EPA listed Libby, Montana on the Superfund Program National Priorities List. Cleanup efforts at 3,000 sites included removal and replacement of over 1 million cubic yards of dirt and building materials throughout Libby. EPA cleanup efforts didn't come to an end until 2018, more than a decade after interventions began. The human health effects from long-term unsafe asbestos exposure can be relatively serious. Asbestos fibers are easily inhaled and carried into the lower regions of the lungs, where they can cause fibrotic lung disease, changes in the lining of the chest cavity, and even lung cancer. This can lead to reduced respiratory function and death. The longer the time of exposure, as for those working in mines, the greater the risk of asbestos-related health effects. The latency period of the health effects due to asbestos is 20 to 50 years. Thus, I am presenting data on respiratory outcomes from 2009 to 2018. As we can see, in 2010, almost 20 years after the mine closed, there was an increase in lung cancer mortality in Montana. The type of asbestos in Libby, Montana, amphibial asbestos, has needle-shaped fibers. Studies suggest it takes much less exposure to this type of asbestos to cause cancer. The decrease in death from 2016 to 2018 is most likely due to advances in medical diagnosis and treatment. Despite the mine's closure, there is concern about the long-term effects of mining operations for both those exposed in childhood and those exposed to lingering environmental contamination. Children are of importance because lung development continues through adolescence until about 18 years of age in girls and the early 20s in boys. As illustrated from the pie chart, adults who used to play at the ball fields near expansion plants in the 1990s reported respiratory symptoms years later in the 2000s. Shortness of breath and coughing accounted for the largest portion of respiratory symptoms. However, if a follow-up study was conducted now, it is possible that the lung disease would be more pertinent in this group, as latency period of the health effects due to asbestos is 20 to 50 years. Tree bark was also found to be contaminated with amphibial fibers throughout Libby, Montana. The first two bars represent trees that were about 100 yards from the former pump house site at the mine. The third bar also represents a lodgepole pine. However, these trees were at the 4-mile mark immediately outside the mine property. The ponderosa pine was on the railroad line approximately 7 miles west of Libby. This graph illustrates that trees served as reservoirs for asbestos fibers. Wood stoves are the main source of home heating in Libby. When amphibial contaminated firewood was combusted in stoves, fibers remaining in the ash would lead to further exposures by becoming free in the ambient air during combustion process. To further illustrate the scope of asbestos contamination, this figure illustrates asbestos found in soil in and around Libby. Scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy of soil northwest and south of Libby were determined to come from vermiculite deposits from the mine. The amphibials known to originate from vermiculite deposits all contain sodium and potassium that can be observed in the EDS spectra. The EPA Superfund sites consist of 8 operable units and extend to areas past Libby, illustrating the range of exposure. The remedy for most of these areas was containment, removal, and institutional controls. The EPA removed over 1 million cubic yards of asbestos-contaminated waste from major source areas and structures. Contaminated soils were disposed of at former vermiculite mines. Contaminated construction debris was placed in specially designed landfill cells. The asbestos exposure in Libby, Montana impacted every aspect of residents' lives. Workers were exposed to high levels of asbestos in the air at the mines during transport and handling operations and during processing operations. Relatives of workers were exposed to asbestos from dirty clothing and the cars of workers returning from the mine. Children played in open piles of contaminated vermiculite, such as those near the ball fields. Outdoors, residents inhaled asbestos from gardening with contaminated soil, and indoors, they were exposed by burning contaminated firewood. The failure to warn and protect mine workers and residents from the dangers of asbestos exposure due to the corporate greed of W.R. Grace was and will continue to be responsible for the suffering and deaths of hundreds of residents of Libby, Montana. The tragedy of the town of Libby highlights the need for strict regulations and control on dangerous industries.